Gabby Hayes and Roy Rogers, two names forever linked in the golden era of Western films. But there's a wild rumor that swirled through classic Hollywood circles for decades. Gabby Hayes utterly hated Roy Rogers. Sounds like drama straight out of a Hollywood script, right? The trusted sidekick who appeared in 44 Roy Rogers films supposedly despised the cowboy star. But is there any truth behind that claim? Or is it just another example of Hollywood gossip getting twisted over time? Gabby Hayes was a quintessential Western sidekick, the grizzled, lovable, sometimes grumpy old-timer who was always there to add a little comic relief or sage advice to Roy Rogers' heroic adventures. With his signature scruffy beard, weathered hat, and slow drawl, Hayes became a staple of the genre. Roy Rogers, on the other hand, was a clean-cut, handsome king of the cowboys, a hero who captivated audiences with his charm, good looks, and trusty horse trigger. The two seemed like the perfect duo on screen, but behind the scenes, rumors whispered of tension, resentment, and even outright hatred. People speculated. Did Gabby Hayes secretly resent Roy's spotlight? Was there jealousy over fame, paychecks, or creative control? Were they rivals locked in a bitter feud that the studios carefully hid from the public? These rumors have fueled countless articles, fan debates, and YouTube videos, but few ever dig into the real story behind the headlines. The truth, as it turns out, is far more interesting and much less scandalous than you might expect. Before we dive into what really went down between Gabby Hayes and Roy Rogers, it's important to understand the context. Hayes wasn't just some sidekick. He was a veteran actor who'd been around the block long before Roy rode into the picture. He played many parts in early silent films and B-movie westerns under different names before settling on Gabby. But despite his success, Hayes had a complicated relationship with the very genre that made him famous. This tension between the man and his work is key to unlocking the mystery behind the hate rumors. Gabby Hayes' story isn't a Hollywood feud. It's a story about an artist's frustration with formulaic storytelling and the limits of his own career. And it reveals a surprising amount about the realities of classic Hollywood westerns, a world that often looks far simpler on screen than it really would behind the scenes. So if you think Gabby Hayes hated Roy Rogers, you're about to get a very different picture. The real story is stranger, more nuanced, and reveals the true nature of their relationship, one of respect, frustration, and maybe even friendship hidden beneath layers of Hollywood myth. But before we get there, let's start by understanding just how much Gabby Hayes really felt about westerns in general, because that's where the story really begins. You might find it hard to believe, but Gabby Hayes, the man whose face is practically synonymous with classic westerns, actually hated the genre. It sounds like a strange contradiction, but Hayes didn't mince words when it came to western films. He once famously said, "I hate them, really can't stand them, they always are the same." That quote alone paints a surprising picture of a man stuck in a career he didn't fully enjoy. Hayes was no fool. He knew the Western formula inside and out. The good guy rides in, fights the bad guy, saves the day, and everything resets for the next story. He found these plots repetitive, predictable, and, frankly, dull. For a man who had worked in film since the silent era, appearing in hundreds of movies, this must have been frustrating. It wasn't just the stories, either. The roles he was given were often little more than caricatures. Grizzled sidekicks who said the same kind of lines and played the same kinds of parts. But here's the kicker. Despite his disdain for the genre, Gabby Hayes became one of the most beloved Western sidekicks in history. That's part of the irony of his legacy. Audiences loved him for the very thing he secretly loathed. His grumpy, slow-talking character was a fan favorite, and studios knew it. They kept casting him in these roles, turning him into a kind of Western mascot. It's important to understand that Hayes' complaints were never really aimed at Roy Rogers or his fellow actors. His frustration was with the formula itself, the scripts, the predictable patterns, the lack of creative challenge. He was a professional after all, and he played his part with skill and charm. But off camera, he was known to express his boredom with the repetitive nature of the films he starred in. In fact, Some stories from those who knew him suggest that Hayes found little joy in the fame that came with Westerns. Instead, he preferred to keep a low profile and maintain a private life away from Hollywood spotlight. The wild adventures you saw on screen were far removed from the man behind the beard. So when rumors circulated that Gabby Hayes hated Roy Rogers, the truth was more nuanced. It wasn't a personal feud or jealousy. It was a reflection of Hayes' creative frustration with genre that he felt trapped him. He resented the limitations the Western formula imposed, even as he became one of its most recognizable faces. This sheds new light on their relationship. Gabby Hayes' hatred wasn't aimed at Roy the man or the success Roy enjoyed. Instead, it was a deep-seated weariness with the repetitive, never-changing world of cowboy movies. And that weariness would shape Hayes' career moves and personal choices in the years to come. But it wasn't the end of the story. There was more behind the scenes, more Hayes' complex feelings about his work and his co-stars. What really happened when Hayes left Paramount and joined Roy Rogers at Republic Pictures? How did their relationship evolve off-screen? And did Hayes ever find a way out of the creative rut he despised? The answers are surprising, and they reveal a side of classic Hollywood you rarely hear about. Gabby Hayes didn't leave Paramount Pictures because he wanted a change of scenery. He left because of one of the oldest reasons in Hollywood: money. Back then, Hayes wasn't even Gabby yet. He went by the name Wendy Halliday and had built a steady, if not entirely glamorous, career playing the scruffy comic relief in low-budget westerns. But when it came time to renegotiate his contract, Hayes asked for a modest raise. Paramount said no. It was a bold move on their part, and one they would later regret. Hayes wasn't a huge star at the time, but he was reliable. He showed up, hit his marks, delivered laughs, and gave the leading man someone to play off. But to the studio, he was still just a supporting character, easily replaceable. So they didn't budge. Hayes, fed up with being underpaid and underappreciated, walked. And just like that, Wendy Halliday disappeared. When he signed on with Republic Pictures, he couldn't take the Wendy name with him. It legally belonged to Paramount. So he rebranded himself as Gabby, a name that would stick with him for the rest of his life. The timing couldn't have been better. Republic was building a rising star, Roy Rogers. They needed a strong supporting cast around him, and Gabby fit the bill perfectly. What followed was a career explosion. Gabby Hayes appeared in 44 Roy Rogers films, more than anyone else in Roy's filmography. The chemistry between the two was undeniable. On screen, they played off each other with ease. Roy as a heroic straight man, Gabby as a grumbling, yet lovable old-timer who always seemed to know a little more than he let on. To outsiders, it looked like a perfect match. But to those who didn't know the backstory, Gabby's sudden shift to Republic and his massive presence in Roy Rogers' films led to speculation. Was he bitter about Paramount? Did he resent having to ride someone else's coattails after years in the business? Did he hold a grudge against the studios, and by extension, Roy? In reality, the answer is far simpler. Gabby wasn't bitter toward Roy. He saw the move to Republic as a new opportunity, a chance to reinvent himself. And while he still hated the repetitive nature of Westerns, he understood their appeal. Roy Rogers wasn't the problem. In fact, Roy was part of the solution. He brought a youthful energy to the genre that Gabby hadn't seen before. Behind the scenes, Gabby and Roy worked smoothly together. There were no tantrums, no rivalry, no power plays. If anything, Gabby seemed to find a certain peace in his role. He may have hated the formula, but he respected the team he worked with, especially Roy. Still, the tension between creative frustration and professional loyalty lingered beneath the surface. Gabby was a man who knew his worth, and being cast aside by Paramount only strengthened his resolve to control his own narrative. That decision to walk away and start over wasn't just about money, it was about pride. But what's even more surprising, the respect that grew between him and Roy over the years. A respect that quietly shut down the very rumors people still talk about today. Let's take a closer look at what really happened behind the cameras. and how Roy and Gabby's bond was deeper than most people ever knew. For all the whispers and rumors suggesting that Gabby Hayes couldn't stand Roy Rogers, people who actually knew the two men tell a very different story. Off camera, there was no shouting, no behind-the-scenes rivalry, no dramatic confrontations. In fact, what existed between them was something much more ordinary and much more powerful: mutual respect. Roy Rogers once described Gabby Hayes not as a grumpy co-star or just a comic relief, but as family. That's not a word Roy threw around lightly. Known for his good-natured, down-to-earth attitude, Roy was a man who valued loyalty and sincerity, both on and off the set. And when he spoke about Gabby, there was admiration in his voice, not contempt. The same went for Dale Evans, Roy's wife and frequent co-star, who often said that Gabby Hayes was one of the kindest, most thoughtful people she had ever worked with. That is a side of Gabby most fans never saw. On screen, he played the cranky old coot with a slow drawl and a face that looked like it had been carved from dry leather. But off-screen, Gabby was cultured, well-read, and polite. He spoke in a much more refined voice than the character he portrayed, and those close to him described him as thoughtful and intelligent, almost the opposite of the old prospector image he projected in film. There's a particularly touching story that often gets overlooked. When Dale Evans adopted her daughter Robin, who was born with Down syndrome, Gabby was one of the few people who consistently offered real, genuine support. In an era when disabilities were often ignored or hidden away, Gabby showed Dale and Roy nothing but love and understanding. He didn't just offer kind words. He offered his time and presence. He was there for them in a deeply human way that went far beyond the boundaries of professional courtesy. This kind of support doesn't come from someone harboring bitterness or hate. Of course, that didn't stop people from reading into things. Gabby was known for keeping to himself during breaks in filming. He wasn't the type to hang around a lot or engage in small talk with the crew, but that wasn't out of arrogance or hostility. It was simply who he was: private, focused, a professional actor who understood that work was work, and Roy respected that. He never expected Gabby to be someone he wasn't. He let him do his thing, knowing full well that when the cameras rolled, Gabby would deliver every single time. So where did the hate theory even come from? Some believe it grew out of Gabby's vocal dislike for Westerns in general. Others think it's just a natural result of people misunderstanding a quiet, reserved man who didn't play into Hollywood's buddy-buddy expectations. After all, we're conditioned to assume that people who work together closely must also be best friends or bitter enemies. But life isn't always that black and white. Gabby Hayes and Roy Rogers weren't drinking buddies, but they had something better: a working relationship built on trust, professionalism, and quiet respect. There were no scandals, no betrayals. Just two very different men who showed up, did their jobs, and understood the value of each other's talents. But for Gabby, that private respect didn't erase his inner conflict. He still felt trapped by the genre, still wished for more creative freedom. And that tension between outward success and inner dissatisfaction would continue to define his legacy. Coming up, we'll look at how that complicated legacy shaped the public's perception of him, and how even decades later, it's still being misunderstood. Gabby Hayes was a Western icon. That's not up for debate. But what is still debated, especially among fans and film historians, is how he felt about the image he left behind. Did he ever come to terms with being typecast as the scruffy sidekick? Or did he go to his grave resenting the very genre that made him a household name? The truth lies somewhere in the middle. Even as Hayes became one of the most recognized faces in the Western world, he continued to carry a quiet sense of frustration. He wasn't the rough, uneducated hillbilly he played on screen. In real life, he was articulate, clean-shaven, and well-spoken. The Gabby character was just that, a character, and that dissonance between the man and the myth took its toll. He had ambitions beyond playing the crusty companion to a singing cowboy. He wanted to stretch creatively, take on different roles, and show audiences that he could do more than mutter "Dad burn it" and chase bad guys through the desert. But in a studio system that prioritized formula over depth, there was little room for evolution. Once you were typecast, you stayed there. That's the tragedy hidden behind Gabby Hayes' smiling eyes. He knew he was good at what he did. He just wished he'd been allowed to do more. Still, Hayes wasn't bitter in the way people might think. He understood the business. He never sabotaged projects, never badmouthed co-stars in public, never pulled rank or demanded special treatment. Instead, he stayed professional, did the work, and treated everyone, from A-listers to extras, with quiet respect. That grace under pressure is part of what made him so beloved among those who actually worked with him. And despite all his reservations about the Western formula, Hayes did take pride in one thing: the fans. He loved how children would light up at the mention of his name. He understood that, for many people, his performances were the heart of those old movies. Even if the stories were predictable, the connection he built with audiences was real. That meant something to him. After leaving film, Gabby didn't just fade away. He made a transition to television in the early 1950s with The Gabby Hayes Show, introducing Western-themed stories to a new generation of viewers. It was clear he still had love for the audience, even if he'd lost patience with the material. The show ran for several years, and during that time, Gabby became something even larger than a movie sidekick. He became a cultural touchstone. But the deeper irony of his legacy is this: while he never saw himself as a star millions did, to fans, he wasn't second fiddle. He was the reason they watched. His grit, charm, and authenticity gave the Western genre a warmth it sometimes lacked. And maybe, just maybe, he realized that before the end. Unfortunately, the idea that he secretly despised Roy Rogers has continued to muddy his legacy. But when you understand the full context, the studio disputes, the creative frustrations, the way he actually acted toward Roy and Dale, it becomes clear the story people thought they knew was way off. Still, one question lingers. If he didn't hate Roy Rogers and he didn't hate the fans, then why did the Gabby Hayes hated Roy Rogers myth become so widespread? The answer lies in what came next. How a few misunderstood interviews and changing public perception created one of the most stubborn rumors in classic Hollywood history. Sometimes, the simplest stories get ignored in favor of the juicier ones. And in the case of Gabby Hayes and Roy Rogers, that's exactly what happened. Despite the quiet professionalism and mutual respect they shared for over a decade on screen, the rumor that Hayes hated Roy Rogers just wouldn't go away. So where did it actually start? It likely began with a few vague interviews in the 1950s, long after Gabby had retired from Hollywood. During one radio appearance, Hayes was asked why he left Westerns, and he gave a half-joking response: "Because I got tired of riding a horse and playing second fiddle to a singing cowboy." It was clearly said with humor, but fans and gossip columnists, always hungry for drama, latched on the phrase "singing cowboy" and drew their own conclusions. Some even twisted the quote to sound more bitter than it was. Before long, rumors began circulating that Gabby resented Roy Rogers specifically. A few tabloid-style publications at the time ran sensational headlines, implying there had been friction behind the scenes, despite offering no actual evidence to back it up. And once a story like that catches fire, it's hard to put it out. The idea of an old Hollywood feud is irresistible. It gives people something to dissect, debate, and speculate over. Audiences love to believe that there's more going on behind the scenes, that the smiles and camaraderie on screen are hiding real drama. And when one half of the duo, Gabby, retires early and becomes reclusive, while the other, Roy, remains a beloved public figure, the contrast only fuels the narrative. Adding fuel to the fire was Gabby's choice to stay out of the spotlight after he left Hollywood. He didn't do many interviews. He rarely attended public events. To many fans, that silence felt suspicious, like he had something to hide. But in reality, he had simply moved on. He lived a quiet life in Burbank with his wife, enjoying the peace that had eluded him during his years in front of the camera. Meanwhile, Roy Rogers continued his career, his brand expanding into music, radio, and television. As the legend of Roy grew, So did curiosity about the people who had once surrounded him. Gabby's absence made him a perfect target for myth-making. And in that vacuum, the Gabby Hated Roy story was born and repeated again and again. But here's what makes a rumor truly collapse. The people who were actually there said otherwise. Co-stars, crew members, and even Roy himself consistently described their working relationship as friendly and respectful. There were no public spats, no leaked letters, no disgruntled memoirs. Just a rumor that gained momentum because it sounded interesting, not because it was true. Still, the myth lingers. You'll find it in fan forums, YouTube comments, and clickbait articles, often repeated without question. It's become part of Hollywood folklore, one of those unsolved mysteries that people cling to, even when all the facts point in the opposite direction. But here's the twist. Maybe the reason the rumor sticks is because it reflects something deeper, a fascination with how fame distorts reality. Gabby Hayes wasn't bitter. He was tired. He didn't hate Roy Rogers. He just hated being boxed in. And as he quietly stepped away from the spotlight, the world kept talking, inventing a conflict that never really existed. Finally, we'll explore how Gabby Hayes should really be remembered, and why his legacy deserves a second look. Gabby Hayes didn't go to Hollywood chasing fame. He arrived there out of necessity, after losing everything in the Great Depression. And in that scramble to survive, he accidentally became a legend, but he was never fully at peace with it. While audiences remember him as a scruffy, lovable sidekick with a wild beard and goofy expressions, the real Gabby was far more grounded. He was a thoughtful, private man who just happened to be exceptionally good at playing a role that millions adored. Yet, in a town built on illusions, that difference between the actor and the act slowly began to define his life and distort his legacy. The truth is, Gabby Hayes was never supposed to be famous. He wasn't chasing the spotlight like so many of his contemporaries. That's part of what made him so different. He didn't hunger for awards, leading roles, or glamorous red carpets. He just wanted to work, do it well, and go home. But what he gave to the Western genre can't be overstated. Gabby brought heart to stories that often focus on shootouts and stoicism. He added soul, comic relief, and unexpected warmth to every scene he was in. He gave cowboy heroes someone to talk to, someone to protect, and often someone to save them. Without Gabby, many of those classic Roy Rogers films would have felt cold and flat. And yet, despite that incredible contribution, he walked away. Not because he was bitter, not because of Roy, but because he knew when he'd had enough. That decision speaks volumes. It takes strength to leave behind fame when you're still beloved. It takes even more strength to never look back. Still, decades later, the myths persist that he hated Roy, that he resented his roles, that he died angry at the genre that made him a star. But none of those narratives really fit the facts. What's more likely is something far more relatable. He was a man who did his job with grace, grew tired of being boxed into one version of himself, and chose peace over the spotlight. And for all the speculation, Roy Rogers never had a bad word to say about Gabby. In fact, he once said in an interview, Gabby was the kind of guy you were lucky to work with once. I got to work with him for years. That one quote may say more about their real relationship than any tabloid headline ever could. Gabby Hayes wasn't just a sidekick. He was the emotional core of a generation of Westerns. And if there's one thing we should take away from his story, it's this. Just because someone played second fiddle doesn't mean they were second-rate. So the next time you see him shuffle across the screen, mumbling something funny or kicking up dust beside Roy Rogers, remember, he wasn't just acting. He was quietly making history. Gabby Hayes may have stepped out of the spotlight, but his impact never faded. If you enjoyed this behind-the-scenes look at his life and legacy, hit that like button. Subscribe for more Untold Hollywood stories.